All right. So just quick couple of things before we get to your bit. You're going to be reading about the next 200 pages of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell over the weekend. So up to and including chapter 3. Or 53. 53. Yeah, that would be... Yeah, 3 would be wrong. That would be...
Backwards.
Yeah. You're also going to have your last vocab quiz to complete by Sunday. And then I'll reopen all of the vocab quizzes, and I'll send everybody a list of which vocab words I think are important, like the ones that might actually appear in the exam. The other thing that I want to let everybody know about is that I have decided to extend the due date for the annotated bibliography slightly. So it'll be due Friday rather than today. I know you already did yours. I've already evaluated it. But this, you've got that out of the way now. You can work on other things. But yeah, those who have not yet completed the annotated bibliography, you can have till Friday to do it. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about anything before we get started?
On the final, I know last semester it was using Nick.
Yeah.
And we had to pull like direct quotes.
Uh-huh.
We're not going to have to do that for this, are we?
No.
Okay, cool.
No, I'm not going to expect you to pull direct quotes. Not in an in-class 2-hour exam. I think that is something that I do if I make the exam online. But it's been my general experience that if it's an in-person class and the exam is online, people usually end up fucking up the exam. And I think that some of that has to do with psychology and with our recall being better in the place where we actually learned a thing. So I think, we're better off, like you guys are better off taking the exam in this room because you're more likely to remember things that you learned here. But yeah, you won't be expected to pull quotes. Any other questions?
Would it be possible if I could present my drawing earlier? Or do you still want to stick with me presenting next Wednesday?
You want to do it on Monday?
Yeah.
I mean, it's to me it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, right? Like if you already have it done, or if you will have it done over the weekend, that's fine. You can absolutely present on Monday. I don't personally care, but
I just figured I'd just go on and get it out of the way.
Yeah, sure. No problem. All right, so you can do that on Monday. All right. Is that all?
Yes.
All right, Dalen, you are up.
Well, I did what I don't know. I hope it's right.
Yeah. Well, and there's no real wrong way to do it.
Yeah, but
And
kind of.
yeah, and you're working with incomplete information, so yeah, 100% not your fault.
I didn't receive an email back by the way.
Yeah.
As of now.
Yeah.
So I just kind of crossed my fingers and came up with one thing. Maybe it will fit, maybe it won't. So for the people themselves, I wrote that women have to wear, they wear anything with like sequins or sparkles on it. Their clothing has to have it on there.
Okay.
And men wear like neutral clothing and they blend in while the women stand out.
Okay.
They don't have like our type of technology. They live their lives through like real communication and like use like horses and stuff for transportation, kind of like Amish live today in our world, like that.
Okay.
They like write letters and have stronger communication or connections with people, and like very little trauma. They're just very easygoing and they really get along with each other and they really talk to each other. And I wish that we were still like that, so I don't think like that.
So do I.
So the families are like close to each other. They have the same like living dynamic that I would say that we, typically do today, like parents, children live together.
Okay.
And then eventually children move out, start their own lives, that kind of thing. Basically like we do. They're friendly with their neighbors, just very nice with each other. They have like a really strong, tight-knit community, and they believe like in treating people the way that you want to be treated.
Okay.
Very wholesome. They create a very wholesome space. So they have like a church-like building. It doesn't have to be called a church, but that's just what I described it as,
Mhm.
like where the community meets every Tuesday and they worship the sun. And like,
Okay.
but not like in the sun god Ra, not like that, like just like the sun.
The actual sun.
The sun.
actual ball of gas in the sky.
And yes, and they
Okay.
believe sunlight is like a gift, and
Okay.
that's what brings good energy is the sunlight.
Okay.
I mean, that's what brings me good energy. So they worship like positivity and kindness and light, you know.
Uh-huh.
And then their economy is prosperous. They grow all their own food. You know, they work their own simple jobs. They have their own form of currency. I did not name it, but they have something. And their political system is based off of like a council of people who present ideas, and then everyone over like the age of 20 votes on it. So they're just very simple and
Okay.
wholesome.
Okay. So kind of what like a direct democracy, like ancient Athens, sort of.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's about it. That's
All
what
right.
I worked with.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So. First, I would like to thank the both of you for showing up. And yeah, let's get back into Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. There's some stuff we didn't cover last time that I'd like to try to get to. But I'm also I was kind of intrigued, actually, Dalen, by something that you noted in your quiz response about how this kind of reminded you of the Harry Potter
It just kind of gave me a
universe.
vibe.
Okay, so I guess what if there's like what's similar to something like Harry Potter?
Well, the magic, I mean, obviously.
Okay,
It's
the-
that just kind of what made me think of it.
Yeah. Okay.
Bringing, like, spoiler alert, and towards the end of Deathly Hallows, when McGonagall brings the statues to life to defend the school.
Okay, so yeah, even some of the magical some of the magical events are similar, right?
Things that you don't just do magic, you have to study it. And that's also,
Okay.
that's the whole concept of Hogwarts is you
Yeah.
don't just do magic.
Yeah.
Study it.
Okay, the idea of magic is sort of like a field of study, right?
Mhm.
One thing that always bugged me a little bit about the idea of Hogwarts too is they've got like all these different sort of like magical classes, but it's like are they learning to do math?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you kind of need to in like potions. You have,
Maybe,
like,
yeah.
Measurements.
Yeah.
It's kind of like built in, like within their studies, they kind of just pick up on basic things that they might.
Yeah, I would hope at least that's.
I mean, they do have a class that's taught by a muggle. That's about muggles.
Uh-huh.
So maybe that professor's teaching them basic math.
Yeah.
And why not just use kids? This whole quill and parchment.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think like that's kind of like meant to be kind of like deliberately archaic, right? You know, it's like we're being deliberately old-fashioned and cutesy here. But I think that there are a couple of other kind of interesting crossovers here too, right? Like one is that both take place in, to some extent, our own world, the kind of like the real world, just kind of alternate fantasy version of it, right? Where magic is real, right? In particular, not just an alternate Earth, but a kind of alternate England. But I think like there is kind of one pretty important difference between the Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell world and the Harry Potter world, right? In Harry Potter, how general is knowledge about magic? Do most people even realize that magic exists?
No.
Yeah, in the Harry Potter books, magic is kind of a closely guarded secret, right? The only people who know it exists who aren't born into wizard families are people born into normal families who are somehow able to do magic, right? The general population has no awareness that there is this kind of other, kind of secret parallel world, right?
I don't understand how that could. I mean, everything that goes on,
Uh-huh.
how do you not pick up on
Yeah.
that at all?
I want to question their system. Like, how did they know the
Uh-huh.
Muggles have potential magic? Like, magic potential? Like, how did they know Hermione had
Yeah,
would be a
there-
great witch?
yeah. There are a lot of these kind of holes that you don't think about the first time you read it, right? I kind of this is the first one. Like I remember in college, my friends and I used to play this role-playing game called Vampire the Masquerade, and the whole point of the game, right, was that there are vampires walking around among us all the time, but in order to avoid drawing attention to themselves, they follow this elaborate set of agreed-upon rules. And punish vampires who break those rules very severely because they put everyone at risk, right? So I think that, what's going on with the Harry Potter books is something a little bit similar to that, right? There's this kind of code, within the Ministry of Magic, right? That people aren't supposed to do these kind of flagrant displays of magic where ordinary people can see it.
And like even then, they seem to not really get punished that harshly when they do.
Yeah.
Like the amount of times that Harry actually like shows magic, they're just like, don't do that anymore.
Yeah. Like flying a car into a tree. And,
Yeah.
yeah.
And they're just like, yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
And they did try to punish him for it. When he saved his cousin Dudley from the Dementor,
Uh-huh.
they're like, he should not be allowed in Hogwarts. And it's like,
Mhm.
he saved someone's life.
Yeah.
I think y'all need to look inwards. Y'all got some problematic people within your own little cabinet.
Uh-huh. But yeah, but- But yeah, like one of the interesting things I think about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is that magic seems to be like not just common knowledge, right? I mean, people can't do it for the most part, but everybody knows about it, and it even seems to be part of people's general education. Like when that publisher, John Murray, who was a real person, he was one of the primary publishers of romantic poetry and prose in the early 19th century. But when he comes to Mr. Norrell, he's talking with Lascelles and Drawlight about this plans for this journal that they all want to publish, right? The Friends of English Magic. He says that all he knows about magic is the basic stuff that they teach everybody in school, right? The assumption being that everybody learns a little bit about magic in school, right? Everybody's publicly aware of this. And again, we have this kind of weird kind of split in English history, right? Between that separate North Kingdom, ruled by John Uskglass, the Raven King, and the South Kingdom, which is, simply normal historical England, right? Ruled by the ordinary historical succession of monarchs.
I feel like I've seen that, the Raven King. Is that like an actual real story? Either I've read a story named called the Raven King, or I've just seen that.
I think that the idea, the association between like wizard kings and ravens, I think, is a pretty tight one culturally, and so you've probably seen a similar character or idea somewhere else before. But yeah, this particular character, John Uskglass, the Raven King, as far as I know, does not exist elsewhere. Is Susanna Clarke's own creation. Yeah, go ahead.
It just seemed like, I feel like I relate ravens with dark magic and stuff just from, I couldn't tell you a specific example, but.
Oh yeah, and this actually has a kind of long historical arc there, right? So like, for example, well, there's one particular reason why we tend to associate ravens with dark magic, right? And that is, like, what do ravens do? How do they survive?
Hearing.
Yeah, they're carrion birds, right? They eat corpses. So they've long been associated with death and with that kind of intermediary period between, death and the soul going on to wherever it's supposed to go, right? But even in Norse mythology, right, the father god, Odin, has two, what's that?
Sorry, that's 2 ravens.
Yeah, he has 2 ravens that sit on his shoulders, right? Hugin and Munin, whose names I believe mean thought and memory. And Odin, in addition to being a war god, is also a god of magic and of kind of secret hidden wisdom, and is the god who guides dead warriors into the afterlife, right? So he's also what's called in studies of mythology and religion a psychopomp. Right? A psychopomp is a god or a spirit who guides you into the afterlife. So, like in Greek and Roman mythology, Hermes/Mercury is a psychopomp because he takes the soul from the body to Hades in the underworld. So yeah, so this is a long-standing association. And I want to kind of use this moment then to kind of transition to the prophecy that Vinculus makes to Norrell, because it is actually it's strongly related to the Raven King. Let me see where that was. I think it was the Magician of Threadneedle Street. So Vinculus, this street magician, shows up in Norrell's house, right? And if we turn to page 130, we have this kind of long, cryptic message that Vinculus delivers to Norrell, right? I reached out my hand. Thought and memory flew out of my enemies' heads like a flock of starlings. My enemies crumpled like empty sacks. I called to them out of mists and rain. I came to them in dreams at midnight. I came to them in a flock of ravens that filled the northern sky at dawn. When they thought themselves safe, I came to them in a cry that broke the silence of a winter wood. So what do you think? What do we already know? Just sit with this part of the little prophecy here for a second. And what do you notice already in this little snippet of kind of blank verse?
The ravens. It's in there.
Okay, ravens all over the place, right? A flock of ravens that fill the northern sky at dawn, right? So ravens and the association with the north, right, where Norrell himself is from. And do y'all know what starlings are?
I think they're type of bird, they're kind of a small, are they a songbird?
Starlings actually, they're large blackbirds that actually also look, they look kind of like small ravens, yeah. And note also, in that first line, I reached out my hand, thought and memory flew out of my enemies' heads like a flock of starlings. What's going on there?
Reference to maybe
Exactly, thought and memory, yeah, Odin's ravens. came to them out of mists and rain. I came to them in dreams at midnight. I came to them in a flock of ravens that filled the northern sky at dawn. And these mists and rain, the dreams at midnight, right? A lot of these sound similar to some of the magical feats that Norrell and Strange perform, right? So, there's, for example, the fleet of ships that Norrell makes out of mists and rain, right? That blockade the French in their ports. They're the nightmares that Norrell and Strange keep trying to send to Napoleon, right? Norrell keeps failing at sending nightmares because he just can't imagine anything horrifying enough. He has no imagination. Whereas Strange is able to send more effective nightmares, right? The rain made a door for me and I went through it. The stones made a throne for me and I sat upon it. 3 kingdoms were given to me to be mine forever. England was given to me to be mine forever. The nameless slave wore a silver crown. The nameless slave was king in a strange country. So the 3 kingdoms.
Isn't it the north, the south, the other lands?
Not quite. This is actually kind of referring to the way different worlds link up in Clarke's conception of the universe here, right? So the 3 kingdoms in which the Raven King holds territory, right, are England, right? Not just Earth, but specifically England. Because magic seems to be specifically connected here to England and to Englishness, right? Napoleon is trying to find magicians of his own and can't. Fairy, and hell. Right, we're told in the footnote here, the Raven King was traditionally held to have possessed 3 kingdoms. 1 in England, 1 in Fairy, and 1, a strange country on the far side of hell. So these are the 3 kingdoms the Raven King rules, right? So he rules across worlds.
Multi-dimensional ruler.
What's that?
It's a multi-dimensional ruler.
Yeah. So good for him, right?
Yeah.
Well done, sir.
Sure. Hell, it's so good.
Well, I mean, what's there's the line from Milton's Paradise Lost, where Satan says it's something like, better to rule in hell than serve in heaven.
Yeah.
There may be, I think there may be a kind of sly reference to that here as well. But there are also these references to the nameless slave here. Now, who's the obvious connection? Who's the obvious candidate in the story thus far for nameless slave in this prophecy? The nameless slave was king in a strange country. Well, I mean, the name Strange does keep popping up, but he's certainly not nameless, and doesn't seem to be or to have ever been anyone's slave. We'll talk a little bit more about Strange in a minute. Let's just put him off to the side. Well, are there any important characters that we've met thus far?
The man with thistle hair?
What's that?
The man with thistle hair?
I think it's certainly, related to the gentleman with the thistle down hair, right? Who is the man with the gentleman with the thistle down hair always trying to amuse and please? Who does he regard with the highest admiration? One of the 2 mortals who are constant guests at his parties every night. There's Lady Pole. That's someone from the same household. Yeah, the gentleman with the thistledown hair has no interest in Sir Walter, right? Leaves Sir Walter, consider Sir Walter, in fact, contemptible and beneath notice.
I'm still trying to figure out the names.
He has a name, right? A kind of use name, but not the name that was given to him by his mother, right? Stephen doesn't know what his mother called him. And there's a point as well where the man with the thistledown hair actually gives him a crown, a scepter, and an orb, right? So he's walking around dressed like a king. So we have here in the narrative up to about the midpoint these two king figures, right? Both of whom are also associated with the color black, right? Stephen, because of his name and because he is a black man. And the Raven King, because of his black hair and his association with the raven, right? So we've got two black kings here. And remember last time we talked about Childermas's reading of the cards, right? And somehow, as he's trying to do this reading, the Emperor card just keeps coming up over and keeps looking more and more like a man with black hair and a raven, right? As he's trying to read Mr. Norrell's fortune. The weapons, page 131, that my enemies raised against me are venerated in hell as holy relics. Plans that my enemies made against me are preserved as holy texts. Blood that I shed upon ancient battlefields is scraped from the stained earth by hell's sacristans and placed in a vessel of silver and ivory. I gave magic to England, a valuable inheritance, but Englishmen have despised my gift. Magic shall be written upon the sky by the rain, but they shall not be able to read it. Magic shall be written on the faces of the stony hills, but their minds shall not be able to contain it. In winter the barren trees shall be a black writing, but they shall not understand it. So what is this prophecy so far suggesting about what happened to English magic?
It's there, it's just the ability to read it and contain it has been lost.
Yeah. And who took it away?
Englishmen. But the Raven King gave it.
Yeah, he gave it, right? This was my gift, right? I gave magic to England. But Englishmen have despised my gift. So then what does he do as a result?
He takes it back.
Yeah, he takes it away, right? So yeah, he is both the giver and what's a good succinct word for somebody who takes something away? Yeah, okay, yeah, giver and taker of English magic, yeah. I can't think of anything better.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, it's just that after a certain point, he simply decides that the gift he's given isn't valued. So he doesn't remove magic, but he seems to remove people's ability to do anything with it, right? In particular, as relates to, he particularly mentions reading and writing here, right? They shall not be able to read it, their mind shall not be able to contain it, it shall be a black writing, but they shall not understand it.
That sounds like frustrating. They know about it, but they can't.
Yeah.
It's like so close and so far away.
If they're not able to write it and read it, then what are Mr. Norrell's books?
Well, Mr. Norrell's books are old, right? And for the most part come from the time before the Raven King disappeared and magic was taken away, right? Because at the time the Raven King disappears, he's supposed to have been over 300 years old.
Yeah, people tend to live, like, people close to magic tend to live very long.
Yeah, and that's another kind of common trope in mythology, right? That there's that whether people whether they make longevity potions or something about magic itself keeps them alive longer, right? Yeah, there's something about like the idea of the wizard as someone who has lived some kind of inordinate amount of time, right? I know in T.H. White's Sword and Stone series, for example, the magician Merlin is living backwards through time, right? And in the 8th century can remember the 20th century, right? So it looks like he's telling the future, but it's only because he's living his life backwards through the past.
There's another common Harry Potter thing.
And yeah, a lot of the Harry Potter wizards are also like,
Ancient.
quite decades, if not centuries old, yeah. But yeah, I wanted to draw attention to the writing portion of this though, because it's going to become important a bit later on, right? So now we kind of see Norrell sort of overvaluing books and writing. But there is a piece of writing that he's already encountered that he doesn't understand. In fact, it may be standing in front of him at this very moment. It is every Englishman's birthright to be served by competent and well-educated magicians, interrupted Mr. Norrell. What do you offer them instead? Mystical ramblings about stones and rain and trees. This is like God bless, who told us we should learn magic from wild beasts in the forest. Why not pigs in the sty, or stray dogs, I wonder? This is not the sort of magic which civilized men wish to see practiced in England nowadays. He glared furiously at Vinculus, and as he did so, something caught his eye. Vinculus had dressed himself with no particular care. His dirty neckcloth had been negligently wound about his neck, and a little gap of unclean skin showed between neckcloth and shirt. In that space was a curious carving mark of a vivid blue, not unlike the upward stroke of a pen. It might have been a scar, the relic of a street brawl perhaps, but what it most resembled was that barbaric painting of the skin which is practiced by the natives of the South Sea Islands. Curiously, Vinculus, who was able to stand entirely at his ease in another man's house railing at him, seemed embarrassed by this mark, and when he saw that Mr. Norrell had observed it, he put his hand to his throat and plucked at the cloth to hide it. So there are two things here in these two paragraphs. One is Norrell's hatred of mysticism. Do you all know what mysticism is?
Like tarot cards and pendulums and seeing things in water and mirrors.
Okay, well, those are things that we often kind of associate with mysticism, right? But if we're talking about mysticism in religion and philosophy, which I think is actually kind of what Norrell is discussing here, right? So the sorts of things that, can we pick apart the sorts of things that seem to piss him off in this paragraph? Like, what kinds of things does he regard as silly or frivolous? What sorts of things does he associate with the word mystical?
Seeing things in nature,
Yeah. Any kind of magic that seems to have to do with nature or learning things from nature, right? Now, mysticism doesn't refer specifically to nature magic, but it does refer to the belief that it is possible to achieve some sort of union between living things and some kind of divine essence through either bodily exercises or spiritual practice.
Like yoga?
Yeah, yoga would be a form of mysticism. Yeah. And mysticism is also often something that is that kind of requires initiation into. There's often a kind of like secret language or code or jargon that the uninitiated aren't meant to understand, right? So it's often like we're talking about like text, the true meaning of which is often couched in symbol and allegory. And if you don't know the codes, if you don't understand the allegory and what ideas the things in the allegory refer to, then the system makes no sense to you, right? And Norrell doesn't like this kind of symbolic logic, right? Norrell likes everything to be laid out square in tables and charts, like they are in Francis Sutton Grove's otherwise extremely boring and inaccurate books, right? He would rather be reading like something like a magical Excel spreadsheet, right? than something that kind of forces him to make sense of a bunch of symbols. But there's a weird symbol actually kind of standing right in front of him here. If we look, what's the weird thing he notices about Vinculus's appearance?
The mark at the base of his throat.
Yeah, a curious curving mark of a vivid blue, not unlike the upward stroke of a pen, right? So what does it look like Vinculus has on his body? Yeah, so Norrell is kind of thinking of this, it's probably some kind of tattoo, right? But it's described as being like the upward stroke of a pen, right? So it looks like writing. And then what do we later learn about Vinculus's father? What did he do? What's that? No, his father didn't tattoo, or at least not directly. Right, his father is this man Clarke. And Clarke ate a book as part of a bar bet, page by page. So, right, keep this in mind because this actually does become really, really important to understanding not just who, but what Vinculus is, right? That this is a man whose father ate a book, and not just any book, but a book of magic purportedly written by the Raven King, right?
He's a walking book.
Yeah, it kind of looks that way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's spouting here the Raven King's prophecy, and we can see a mark on his body that looks like the upstroke of a pen. So yeah, that's a pretty good guess, right? That's a pretty good assumption about what Vinculus is. If we look at the rest of his prophecy here too, right? 2 magicians shall appear in England. A sort of exclamation broke from Mr. Norrell. An exclamation that began as a cry and ended as a soft, unhappy sigh. So from the first line of this prophecy about magicians, right, Norrell is unhappy. Why?
Because another magician has
It's 2 magicians. Ah!
all that work.
I know. This is exactly the situation he wants to prevent, right? He does not want there to be 2 magicians. He wants to be the only one. The first shall fear me. The second shall long to behold me. The first shall be governed by thieves and murderers. The second shall conspire at his own destruction. The first shall bury his heart in a dark wood beneath the snow, yet still feel its ache. The second shall see his dearest possession in his enemy's hand. The first shall pass his life alone. He shall be his own jailer. The second shall tread lonely roads, the storm above his head, seeking a dark tower on a hillside. I sit upon a black throne in the shadows, but they shall not see me. The rain shall make a door for me, and I shall pass through it. The stone shall make a throne for me, and I shall sit upon it. So it's obvious who the 2 magicians are, right?
Yeah.
The first is clearly Norrell, and the second is Strange. So let's talk a little bit about Strange and where he differs from Norrell. What is Strange like? What's his method of doing magic like?
Combine a bunch and hope for the best.
Yeah. So Norrell uses formulas he learns from books, right? Strange doesn't work that way, right? Strange works primarily by figuring out a principle and then trying to apply it elsewhere, right? So what else does this tell us about Strange's magic that is different from Norrell's?
There's left. His magic is probably a little bit wilder.
Okay, it's a little bit, yeah.
Because
Yeah.
He's had to scrape by on what knowledge he can get because Mr. Norrell has
Because Mr. Norrell has all the books and won't share them, yeah.
I mean, he said that. He's like, oh, I've gone through booksellers who promised me that they had plenty of books. And I get there and they're like, oh, well, we had them.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Mr. Norrell's the one that bought them all up.
Sure, yeah, Norrell got there first, right? And in fact, the very thing that decides Norrell in favor of sending Strange, the only other magician in England, off to Europe to fight in the Napoleonic Wars, right, is that the Duke of Roxburgh's library, which is sure to include some books of magic, is about to come up for auction, and he doesn't want Strange bidding on them. So we'll talk about how he gets around to that line of reasoning in a minute, right? But I think getting to this whole kind of like wilder thing, like what is Strange able to do that Norrell isn't?
Actual magic.
Well, Norrell does actual magic, right? He made those statues talk. He creates those ships out of mist.
Yeah, but Strange is the one that's able to send the nightmares to Napoleon.
Yeah, which again is something that Norrell is able to do, but because Norrell lacks imagination, his nightmares aren't very convincing, right? So he is able to do things imaginatively that Norrell can't, right? And what has Strange been having to do to create spells from day one?
Call on fairy.
Pardon?
As he gets to, he's had to call on fairy. No, I'm getting lines crossed.
Yeah, Strange doesn't seem to know how to call on fairies yet, right? At least not directly. But he's able to improvise, right? And in fact, he has to. Whereas Norrell doesn't work that way. Right, oftentimes, right, Strange gets into a situation and whatever principle Norrell taught him, or whatever spell Norrell taught him, isn't quite right for the specific situation, right? But a principle can be extracted from it that maybe would work here. So, for example, when he has to get that ship off the sandbar in the port, right? There's nothing in the book that tells him how to do that. He just has to figure it out. And, knowing, very little about ships, this makes it rather difficult for him. So, yeah, he improvises and he adjusts based on circumstances and experience, right? So we talked a little bit last time about how Norrell's magic is related very closely to literary neoclassicism, right? So can somebody remind me a little bit about what we said about neoclassicism?
It was an attempt to make English literature more like Greek and Roman.
Okay.
And that it tended to deal in epics, tragedies, pastoral elegy, bass, epistle, verse, essays, and it was about diligence and craft and rules.
Yeah, so they only worked in genres that the Greeks and Romans worked in, right? If the Greeks and Romans didn't do it, neither did the neoclassicists. None of these, sonnets or, other, or villanelles or things that the French or Italians had added to English literature, right? No, just Greek and Roman classical genres. And yeah, it was very much about learning the craft of literature, learning the craft of verse, right? Learning the proper way to make it, and recapitulating the wisdom of the ages rather than coming up with something wholly new, right? Now, the big literary movement in England of the early 19th century, when most of this is taking place, is not neoclassicism. It's romanticism. So what, if anything, do y'all know about romanticism? What does a romantic writer or artist value?
Maybe.
Okay, yeah, beauty, right? Although one could argue that most artists do, right?
Oh, sorry. All I'm thinking is, what is it? The bohemian, ideals. I'm thinking there's Moulin Rouge right now.
Okay.
It's like beauty, justice, and something else. A lot of the romantics are very flowery in their language.
Although, they often didn't see it that way themselves. I think that if you're thinking of something like Moulin Rouge, you're actually thinking of something a little bit later that is moving closer into what is often called aestheticism. The Romantics actually typically believed in a more simplified, stripped down language. Wordsworth, for example, argued that poetry should sound like, as he put it, a man talking to men, right? That it should be in the language of ordinary people as ordinary people speak it. Now, some of Wordsworth's detractors might say that he wouldn't know what an ordinary person sounded like if one walked up and bit him on the ass, but that's neither here nor there, right? The ideal was to try to make poetry sound like real speech, right? The biggest romantic value, and I'm putting this in all capital letters to demonstrate how important it was imagination. And they defined it in very, very specific ways, right? So the definition I'm going to go with here, because I think it's what's most relevant to what's going on in this novel, is Samuel Taylor Coleridge's. So Coleridge makes a distinction between what he calls fancy and what he calls imagination. I think we may have talked a little bit about this when we talked about definitions of fantasy early on. We might have talked a little bit about this with Tolkien. I think we definitely would have looked at this a little bit last semester in the Tolkien class when we talked about on fairy stories. Because Tolkien actually just draws a lot, whether consciously or unconsciously, from Coleridge there. But basically the way Coleridge splits these two faculties of mind up, right, is that fancy is essentially a form of memory in which your mind just sort of plays with fixed counters, right? So you take things that you have experienced, things that you remember, and you just rearrange them into new patterns. There's no creation involved with the fancy, right? Now, the way Coleridge defines imagination, on the other hand, right? So with the fancy, you're just remembering things and moving them around and putting them in different situations. Imagination involves kind of melting down your sense impressions and making them into entirely new things. So a way that I like to think about this distinction, right, is that, say, you have experience of horses and goats, right? So a poet who relies primarily on the fancy, might have, a sort of procession of animals in which he includes these particular creatures, and the sorts of ideas with which both are associated, right? So there might be a kind of allegory of animals, where the goat is associated with certain qualities and the horse is associated with others, right? Whereas an artist that relies primarily on imagination might look at that goat, look at that horse, and in his imagination kind of like melt the two things down and combine them into something like a unicorn, right? So yeah, you're still dealing with things that come from your sense impressions and from your memory, right? But you're making them into something new, right? And Romanticism values, right, novelty and newness to an extent that the Neoclassicists would regard as wrong-headed. And individual creativity. In fact, it's really from the Romantics that we kind of get the myth of the artist as solitary creative genius, right? By and large, like historically speaking, we've tended to think of artists as people who are, in fact, kind of
Brooding loners.
Well, yeah, like that idea comes from the Romantics, right? The idea of the artist as a brooding loner who's just kind of sitting alone, spouting out reams of poetry, right? The artist, in earlier periods was often, somebody whose relationship to the public was a little bit more kind of transactional. So the public was, the audience was actually kind of considered in an important element of the creation of the work. Patrons were considered an important element of the creation of the work, right? So what the artist was doing was often kind of channeling the desires of other people. And even in the era of Romanticism, that's still frequently what the artist was really doing. But it's all wrapped up in this mythology of the individual creative mind, right? And in fact, we often tend to think of Romanticism as nature poetry, right? Because mostly because a lot of the major romantics, people like Wordsworth and Coleridge and Percy Shelley, found a lot of personal inspiration in nature. But nature is never really the main thrust of their work. The thing that makes nature important to a romantic poet is that it's a catalyst for thought, right? It spurs meditation. If you look at most of the major romantic poems, they're not really about whatever natural object actually starts the poem, right? The natural object is just a way to get going. What romantic poems are usually actually about is thinking. They're about working through the poet's mental processes and putting them onto paper. So what you're seeing is the activity of an individual mind meditating on a particular subject. That's what most romantic poetry really ends up being about. And there's one other major difference between Romanticism and Neoclassicism as well. What was the Neoclassical attitude towards the supernatural and towards superstition?
Anti-superstition.
Yes, superstition bad, right? Human beings are reasonable, right? We have the capacity for reason, and we must exercise it. In so doing, we must banish all ghosts and fairies, right? The Romantics, on the other hand, tend to say yes, please, to ghosts and fairies, and to the irrational generally. I mean, Coleridge wrote poems about vampires and zombies, right? So there's plenty of supernaturalism in Romanticism. And I think that is a thing to remember as we look at the character of Strange himself over the course of the rest of the narrative. Now, it's 1:30. I know we usually stop at 1:45. There are only two of you here, though. I get that we're all tired. So I think what we'll do is pause this here, try to carry the rest of this over into next time, right? And we'll maybe draw on some of the more specific historical references that are in the text then, right? So let me give you the reading questions for next time. And then I will let you go. Does anybody have any questions about any of this, by the way, before I...
I also asked him the way out my last last year. I know you said you already went over my bibliography. I haven't had a chance to look at it.
Uh-huh.
Do you want me to review it with different sources?
Oh, no. I mean, yeah. There are two basic reasons why I give you the bibliographies. One is so that you don't think this is all coming out of my own head. And to be transparent, right? This is where I'm getting ideas from. And the other is to give you something to draw on for your research papers, right? To give you a starting point.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if we could use them or not, and I didn't realize until after I'd done it, I was like, oh, let me check.
Yeah, no. Yeah. Well, the research that I usually do before I teach a new class is usually pretty thorough.
You had every source that I could see. Everything that I was looking at, I was like, oh, he's got it on there already.
know, that's like most of my sources for my paper are gonna come from the bibliography you
Yeah.
provided. And it's
Mhm.
like, it's great, I'm glad I have this. I still have to go through and read these sources.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, you still, yeah, you still have to figure out how to access the sources. Yeah, I mean, it's, yeah, there's, yeah, no problem with you using the same sources I used.